3, Madam Mayor. We are now live.
Thank you very much. Welcome to our special meeting of Municipal Council tonight for Tuesday, February the 8th, 2022. I'd like to call this meeting to order at this time and ask if there's any declarations of interest. Seeing none, I will move to the land acknowledgement statement. The Town of East Gwillimbury recognizes and acknowledges the lands originally used and occupied by the First Peoples of the Williams Treaty First Nation and other Indigenous peoples. And on behalf of Council, I thank them for sharing this land. We would also like to acknowledge the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation as our closest First Nation community and recognize the unique relationship the Chippewas have with the lands and the waters of this territory. They are the water protectors and the environmental stewards of these lands, and we join them in this responsibility. I am moving to deputations, and at this time we do not have any deputations. I will move to workshop. We are here tonight for a workshop regarding Reserves Council workshop presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to staff.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And just before we begin our first evening workshop of the 2022 calendar year, just want to remind folks that it is a two-part workshop this evening. The first part is regarding our fiscal position with regards to reserves and debt. And Council asked for that during the budget process, and Treasurer Marshall and his team have developed an excellent workshop for this evening. I anticipate it'll probably, with questions and answers and other matters, be about 1 hour. And then we have a closed session dealing with municipal real estate and disposition or acquisition of property. That'll be for the balance. It'll be a non-public in-camera session, and then we'll close the meeting. I just wanted to start this evening's meeting with to share some news that we received just late last week regarding General Manager Marco Ramuno. And Marco is a good friend and ally of myself and many others in our leadership team. And Marco approached me late last week to indicate that he had some unfinished business to take care of in Aurora. And he was heading back to Aurora to take up the charge of their development services area, where he'd left to join us not too long ago in 2019. And so I just want to thank Marco for his efforts over the last 3 years. They did a terrific job, helped solve our zoning bylaw conundrum that he walked into that initially. And he did some terrific accomplishments over the years, everything from working on our heritage list to attracting and working on currently the largest employer in the town's history. So kudos to Marco for building a great team here, for being such a good person and active member of our senior leadership team. We do have a plan under works currently, working with Deputy Mark Velchich and our human resources area. We are working with the leadership team in development services now, Lawrence Cuck and Adam Robb in particular, and with our building branch with Andres Yone and Chris Burns, our new deputy. And we're going to include all of the employees and members of that department in our move forward strategy. We have a meeting with the full department tomorrow, and we will be bringing further plans for our move forward approach to council in the very near future. So just wanted to bring that to council's attention and the public's attention, as these things tend to the word gets out very quickly. So on that note, Madam Mayor, I'll pass it back to you, and we could commence this evening's workshop.
Thank you very much. We're going to be dealing with reserves tonight, and I will turn the workshop over to staff.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of council. If you could go to the next slide, please. Yes, so tonight I am joined by Deputy Treasurer and Director of Finance, Valerie Adema, and Manager of Development Finance, Kirsten Dax, and we'll be going through a presentation for you on the status of our reserves and some of the areas that we're kind of looking at and focusing on as we move forward. So I think you'll see by the end of the presentation that we are in pretty good shape in terms of our reserves, but there's some things that we just have to keep our eye on. So with that, with your permission, I'll pass it on to Ms. Adima, who will take part in the first part of the presentation.
Thank you.
I'm on mute. Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Next slide, please. Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of council, and members of the public watching. The town currently holds more than 50 separate reserve accounts. These reserves are grouped into the three categories that you see here on the slide: operating, growth-related, and capital asset management. Reserve balances are reported to council and the public on the reserve continuity schedule that is provided during budget development time, as well as in the annual financial statements. The operating, capital and asset management, as well as the CCC portion of the growth reserves, are reported in detail each year in the accumulated surplus note of the annual financial statements. Whereas the development charge portion, or the DCs, of the growth-related reserves are reported as part of the obligatory reserve funds. Operating reserves are specific to program activities, and there is some flexibility in how those funds are used. Examples of these reserves include funds that have been set aside each year for the elections, winter operations, and insurance. The reserves in this category relating to our fee-supported areas, such as building and planning, are used to manage the fluctuating activity related to the various stages of development. Growth-related reserves are the development charges and community capital contributions, more commonly known as DCs and CCCs. The use of these funds is controlled by legislation to provide for growth-related requirements. Capital and asset management reserves are specific reserves intended for the eventual replacement of town assets. This would include buildings, infrastructure, as well as technology. They can only be used for major maintenance if these repairs would extend the life of the asset. Next slide, please. At the end of 2021, we estimate the total uncommitted reserve balance for the town will be $125.3 million. This estimate includes all approved open capital up until the end of 2021, but does not include contributions or draws approved in the 2022 budget. Of that $125 million, 55% is related to our growth-related reserves, or DCs and CCCs. Next slide, please. BMA Consulting is a company that gathers data annually from all municipalities to create a municipal comparative study. The 2021 study is based on 2020 year-end data from both the financial statements for each municipality, as well as the financial information returns submitted to the province. The first graph you see compares tax reserves to tax debt, meaning reserves and debt that do not include water and wastewater, and obligatory reserves such as DCs. As you can see from the York Region municipalities included here, EG is the only municipality remaining with no tax-supported debt. It is also maintaining its highest reserve per capita position with a level of just over $1,600 per capita. The York Region average is $255 per capita for debt and approximately $850 per capita for reserves. The second graph on this slide shows the debt to reserve ratio for York Region municipalities. The average debt to reserve ratio is 0.32%, where EG still remains debt-free. Next slide, please. This slide shows a 5-year historical pattern of the reserve balances. The operating reserves are intended to provide for short to mid-term expenditures and provide stability for tax and fees to smooth out spikes and drops relating to unexpected and one-time expenditures. Operating reserves include reserves such as insurance, firefighter staffing, winter operations, public art, and real estate. All of these reserves are in a positive balance. Development and fee reserves fluctuate with the development activity. From 2016 to 2018, we saw significant growth in the development engineering reserve. Increased building activity in 2017-2018 has contributed to the positive balance in the building reserve, and we continue to see growth in that area. At the end of 2021, building, engineering, and fill reserves are all in a positive position. Strategies are being reviewed and developed for both planning and park development to ensure that they are sustainable into the future. Next slide, please. This graph shows the outlook for the next 5 years for the operating reserves. While we do see a projected decline in the development and fee-related area, they are still in a healthy position as growth levels stabilize. There are a few considerations to take into account when reviewing projected balances. It is important to ensure that our long-term budgeting for both operating and capital reflect the anticipated growth in activities throughout the town. When reviewing upcoming budget outlooks, we are paying attention to the planning reserve to ensure that we adjust the costs to align with projected revenue into the future. We've also identified that some of our capital-related contributions are being directed into the Emergency Services Reserve, and these should be reprofiled into an Asset Management Reserve. I will now pass the presentation on to Kirsten Dax to review the growth-related reserves.
Madam Mayor, could I make a suggestion? A lot of material and volume and good news stories here, actually, and was wondering if it would be appropriate if council wanted to make some comments at this time with regards to this component of the presentation. Some of the debt and reserve balance slides are quite graphic, so I don't know if anybody wanted any more information or questions regarding that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Members of council, questions to the first part of our presentation? Councillor Roy DeClemente, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The one question that came to me as I was reviewing these slides ahead of our meeting was wondering about sort of target balances for our operating reserves. When we work with the library, we established a level and a dollar figure that was equivalent to a certain amount of operating time for the library. I'm wondering if we have a similar strategy for these reserves, for the operating reserves, so that we know we've hit our limit, we've hit the forecast, and that we don't need to continue to sock away money in the operating reserve, and we can put it into asset management or something of that sort. So just wondering if we have a strategy or a policy for that.
Thank you. Staff, who would like to answer that one? Mr. Marshall?
So I can take a stab at it, if you don't mind, Madam Mayor, and I can be supported by staff if I go off course a little. So what we are trying to do in terms of our targets is we look at our, we've established 10-year operating capital plans, operating and capital plans. So we look at what our expenses are going to be throughout a 10-year time period, and we try to match our, make sure that we have enough funding in the reserve to match those expenditures. So we don't have like a 3% of operating expenditures for most of our operating reserves. We look at what our planned expenditures are going to be. So that's, it's important that we have good 10-year plans, which we've been working on over the past few years, and they're coming forward, and they're pretty good in terms of identifying what we're going to need in the next 10 years.
Councillor Roy DeClemente, does that answer your questions?
A little bit, but not completely. I'm looking at this slide, for example, and it shows that our program-related reserves are projected to drop slightly, just below 6 million. I would anticipate that our operating costs would be climbing. I'm using my experience with the library. In the library board, we have an operating reserve policy that has a limit of, I believe it's about a month's worth of operating costs for the library. And I'm wondering if we have something similar for the town. Obviously, it would be of greater scale, of course. Through you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Marshall?
Okay. So in terms of the program-related reserves, we've, although they are dropping a little bit, our planned expenditures within the 10-year plan will be sufficient to cover what we have in the reserve and our planned contributions to the reserve. So in terms of the development and fee supported, we are looking at our expenditures, in particular with our planning reserve, because we noticed that there are some additional expenditures that are drawing the reserve into a negative balance, or bringing it towards a negative balance. And we want to make sure that one, we are supporting the reserve with sufficient revenues, and two, that the expenditures are applicable to that reserve. So one of the things that we've done with some of the other reserves was adjust the reserve, the draws in the reserve based on what our operating costs are going to be. So, for example, we had salaries that we had applied 100% towards the growth-related reserve. However, we know that some of the staff are not working 100% on growth-related items, so we've started transferring some funding from the tax-supported reserves to offset those costs. So that's the exercise that we're going to be looking at on the planning reserve, to make sure that it's sustainable over the course of a 10-year period.
Councillor Roy DeClemente, does that answer your question?
I will take this offline with staff, and happy to move forward with the rest of the workshop. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, all members of council, if there are things that you think about after we close our meeting, staff I know are available to answer any questions that you might come up with in the next few days as well. Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. The growth-related reserves are used to fund new infrastructure required to service growth. The use of these reserves is restricted by legislation. The two categories of growth-related reserves maintained by the town are community capital contribution and development charges. The graph shows that 2021 saw a spike in development activity. In fact, the town collected more than twice the amount from 2020, $3.5 million in CCCs and $26.6 million in DCs. Although numbers aren't yet finalized, the 2021 reserve balances are projected at $15.5 million in CCCs and $50.4 million in DCs. The next slide, please. The development charge bylaw sets the rates for contributions to the growth-related reserves. The town is legislated to perform a review of the DC background study and bylaw every 5 years. The rates are set so that in theory, the reserve balances should be fully spent on growth-related infrastructure at the end of the planning period, which is 20 years for roads, water and wastewater services, and 10 years for all other services. However, since bylaws are updated at least every 5 years, there are usually balances in the reserves. On February 1st, Council endorsed an amendment to the development charges bylaw, and we plan to perform a full update starting in 2023. The Community Capital Contribution Accord was adopted in 2014, and we plan on examining the CCC in 2023 to see if there may be an opportunity to update that agreement. The graph on the right uses the long-term budget and outstanding building permits to be pulled in order to show a 5-year projection of the two growth-related reserves. The slope on the topmost line of the graph represents the significant draw on the indoor recreation and library DC reserves being used to construct the Health and Active Living Plaza. Despite this large construction project, we project that growth-related reserves will remain in a favorable position over the next 5 years. The next slides will be presented by Treasurer Marshall.
So, Madam Mayor, maybe this is an opportunity to take a break and see if there's any questions on the growth-related reserves.
Thank you very much. Are there questions of staff? I'm not seeing any at this time. That doesn't mean that later on we may have some questions as things move along. Thank you.
Asset management reserves are set up to fund major costs that will be incurred on existing assets over their life cycle, and prepare for eventually replacing those assets. Asset management practice says that there should be enough money in the reserve to actually pay for the replacement of your assets. So the calculation on what that number is requires developing an asset management plan to look at when you need to do major repairs or of your assets and eventually replace them. And these plans usually are looked at over a 50 to 100-year time cycle. So the province has passed legislation that requires municipalities to have a asset management plan in place for all of their assets and a strategy to fund that plan. And it has to be done by July of 2025. And staff are working on this plan, and we are in good shape to meet that timeline. So in lieu of that, a common asset management practice is to target having funds in the reserve, having enough funds in the reserve to pay for what you've actually used. So if you have an asset that was worth $50,000 and you've used half of that asset, you should have $25,000 in that reserve for to plan for its eventual replacement. So municipalities, as a measure of this use the term called accumulated amortization, which is a proxy for the amount of what an asset has been used over time. So this amount is found on financial statements of municipalities, and this is what we've been using for our target for the asset replacement reserves. So you see on this graph here, our reserve balances over the past 6 years have been increasing very steadily, mainly due to our budgeted contributions, allocation of operating surpluses over time, and the multi-year funding plan, which has carved out some tax supported room for the eventual operation of facilities. So as we carve that out, the money that we've been able to reserve have been placed in the facilities reserve here. So that's what you see in terms of the balance here. So next slide, please. So based on the town's financial statements, our target for what we should have in our tax-supported asset management reserves is a bit over $60 million. You see that we're at about 20 right now. Our current budget has approximately $3.7 million in contributions from the tax levy to support these reserves. 1.1 million of that, however, is the result of the multi-year funding plan, and those contributions will be redirected in 2025 to support the operations of the Help and Active Living Plaza. So as well, we are monitoring the longer-term capital plans for the tax-supported programs and what their funding requirements may be. And we've been able to identify that there may be some potential pressures on the roads capital reserve over time that we need to keep an eye on. So currently we are contributing $453,000 a year to the reserve. In our 2022 budget, we have a project for major repair and replacement of the East Town Line Bridge. Our share of those costs is about $1.7 million, 1.1 of that being funded from the reserve. And engineering staff have also highlighted that there's potential for some other bridges that may need some significant repair and replacement in the near future. So we need to keep our eye on that. There are streetlight poles that are going to be needing replacement over the next few years. This provides an opportunity for us to convert those existing lights into our LEDs. Our General Manager Molinari will be coming forward with a report to council on this potential program and the cost implications that are associated with the conversion and retrofit. As well, in 2023, there's plans for a stormwater management master plan. And that master plan will also incorporate some cost requirements associated with undertaking the master plan. So those are some areas that we've identified as pressures to this reserve. So to address pressures in the short term, we will be recommending that a part of any annual surplus that we incur be directed towards this reserve. As well, if there are some pressures that that exceed the reserve, we have the general capital reserve that we can use, and that's part of the purpose of that reserve is for some extraordinary items that are that we need to cover. But in the long term, we believe that the budgeted contribution to the reserve needs to increase. So what we will be proposing is that the multi-year plan, when it is completed in 2025, be refocused towards asset management and in particular the roads reserve. So many municipalities in York Region have a dedicated tax levy that goes towards capital replacement, and so this wouldn't be uncommon. So we're also keeping our eyes on other reserves that in this tax-supported category to make sure that the contribution levels are sufficient to meet projected costs. So next slide, please. So similar to the tax-supported asset replacement reserves, similar methodology for the water and wastewater asset replacement reserves. And you see that the balance in the reserves have increased steadily over the past few years. Next slide, please. So based on our financial statements, the target for these reserves is a bit over $50 million. The water and wastewater financial plan that was approved by council in 2020 has included annual contributions of approximately $4 million to the reserves in order for it to reach the target that has been set. The plan also included a 2% increase to the water and wastewater rates each year, partly to fund this increase in reserve contribution, but also to offset the regional water and wastewater rate increases that have been approved by their council of 3.3% annually. So our current 2022 budget has an anticipated contribution to reserve of $1.8 million. However, it's good to note that over the past 5 years, we've been able to contribute on average $3 million a year to the reserve. So we're close to our target, but not quite there. So I guess the message would be to kind of stick with the financial plan and continue the course that we're on. Next slide, please. So maybe I'll pause here and take any questions regarding the asset replacement reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Questions? Councillor Roy DeClemente, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through you to staff. The tax-supported asset management reserve, the target, I think that was 2 or 3 slides back. The target shows just over 60 million as being what's projected or required by the municipality. Why does it stay static and not change? It's sort of flatlined over the course of the timeline that you've put in the chart. Why doesn't it adjust according to need?
So through you, Madam Mayor. So the that target is based on the accumulated amortization balance that is in the town's financial statements. So in theory, it would increase based on the increase in our amortization amount throughout the 10-year period, but it would also decrease too based on when we disposed of our assets. too. So it would fluctuate. So just for ease of presentation, we have set that target as a 2022 target and to reach that number. But in fact, it would fluctuate, that target, if we were using that as our goal.
It would make sense to me, through you, Madam Mayor, that if our infrastructure aged and we had to invest in repairing it, that the requirement for asset management funds would address that and either drop or increase based on that age. But it seems to be, I think it was a 10-year cycle, and it didn't change at all. So it was a little bit challenging for me to understand what was happening there. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Marshall? I'm not seeing any.
Madam Mayor, I have my hand up.
Oh, go ahead, please, Councillor Crothers.
Thank you. I know it's hard to see when we're all just the little ones at the top there. I just have some comments on the slide that's in front of us. It's interesting because there was just something on Global the other day that was talking about municipalities and the climate crisis, and talking about how municipalities are where we used to be so focused on net zero. What's becoming more obvious is the effects of climate change, and having money set aside to deal with like the flooding that they got out in BC, making sure in advance of that our critical infrastructure, roads, bridges, that sort of thing, our water supply are all reinforced and against any sort of effects of climate change, when we're going to start seeing these 100-year storms more frequently. So it's something that's popping up in the media as well. So I'm glad that we're giving it some consideration. I think it's something that's going to become increasingly important, and it would be prudent to be ahead of the curve on this one.
Thank you. Did you want a response, or?
No, just commenting. Thanks.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? I'm not seeing any at this time. We have additional reserve considerations.
Yes,
Mr. Marshall, go ahead.
Madam Mayor. Yeah, so just to further the thoughts on this topic, we have on our radar the potential need for a funding mechanism or funding source for any future environmental initiatives or related to the environment or to the climate. The environmental initiatives program that will be commencing in 2022, one of the mandates or work in that work plan will be to identify any potential expenditures or funding requirements, and help recommend some funding sources for those requirements, which could include using the Community Capital Contribution Reserve for the environment and watershed enhancement, and or establishing a dedicated reserve for environmental purposes. So as we go through that exercise, that will be one of the takeaways from that. The other consideration that I wanted to identify is a result of our development charge DC amendment. So the legislation had changed such that we're no longer allowed to collect development charges for municipal parking. So we are required to close that development charge reserve and establish a new reserve for municipal parking purposes that's not under the DC regime. So we'll be bringing that forward most likely in April for a bylaw to establish that reserve. So next slide, please. So I did mention earlier about operating surpluses, and the town does have annual operating surplus, which fluctuate year to year. They're hard to predict, but we do have them. These surpluses are allocated annually to our reserves, and it's a helpful strategy that helps us support some of council's key initiatives. So we go through a process of a methodology to recommend how these surpluses get allocated, and we bring that to council each year as part of the year-end audit process. We bring that for council approval. And the points here are the methodology that we use to allocate that surplus. So basically, the fee and rate supported surpluses get allocated to the reserves right off the bat. We try to top up any of the tax supported reserves that are in a negative balance or projected to be in a negative balance in the year. We make contributions to our asset replacement reserves, and we contribute to reserves based on the council approved objectives and priorities. So some municipalities have a documented surplus management policy. Some don't. We do not have one, but if we were asked to bring one forward, this would be the basis on what we would make the policy on. So so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on this.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Questions? I'm not seeing any. Oh, Councillor Crone, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and for you to Mr. Marshall. Clearly, your presentation shows that East Gwillimbury is in a very favorable position where we're accumulating money and not having to pay servicing costs on loans and debt. So that's good news. So my question is, when we have millions in reserve, what are we doing with that money? Are we earning a decent level of interest on it? That help me recall from the budget process. What becomes of that interest that is earned, and how does that factor into our finances? I think there's some people that are watching might be interested to know.
Sure. So through you, Madam Mayor, yes, we do invest a good portion of the reserve balance that we have. We were fortunate enough before COVID hit, just basically about a week before everything started shutting down, we were able to lock in some favorable rates for our investments, and we anticipated that it saved us about 500,000 in lost interest because we locked in a couple days before. So those investments are actually coming due shortly, and so we're going to be looking at it again. And fortunately, rates are starting to increase again, so we might have been able to come through the lull or the downturn and done some favorable returns.
500,000 is quite a win for us. So really good news. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Madam Mayor. No further questions.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Councillor Persichini, go ahead, please.
To you through Warren Marshall. It shows on the paper we're so far #1 on saving money and budgeting, and are we not? Just to verify that so the public would know that we're #1 and we're also the lowest tax. Am I correctly? I just want to make sure we're up here with the financial, and we're also tax-wise we're the lowest. Am I right?
So through you, Madam Mayor, we do have the lowest relative tax for a single-family dwelling, and we do have no debt, and our reserve per capita is the highest amongst all the municipalities in York Region.
So thank you to all the staff and whoever does those crunches, the numbers. Congratulations on your good work, and hopefully the next 3 to 5 years we'll be in the same position. But unfortunately, sometimes things change. But anyway, congratulations to all. Thank you for doing a great job. And I guess it all reflects on all of us. You know, we owe these goods what our staff will, do out behind the scene. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Persichini. This has not been an accident. This is something that has been very strategically planned, and congratulations to staff. We all out in the community talk about our financial position, and we should be very, very proud of it. It's working out exactly as we anticipated, and in fact, in some cases, better than we had anticipated. So, Mr. Marshall, you and your staff, congratulations, and our thanks to you for having the foresight to put us in the position that we're in today. Any other questions or comments? I'm not seeing any. Okay. With that, I have a resolution, be it resolved that the Reserves Council workshop presentation dated February 8th, 2022 be received. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Persichini, Councillor Crone, all those in favor? And that's carried. We are now going to go into a closed meeting to proceed into a closed meeting of Municipal Council. Be it resolved that Council proceed into a closed meeting of Municipal Council at 6:41 p.m. to deal with the following matters: a proposed or pending acquisition or disposition of land by the municipality, Municipal Act Section 2392C, strategic property discussion. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Morton, Councillor Foster, all those in favor? And that's carried. We'll just wait a few moments until we know that we are in private session. And then, Madam Clerk, if you would let us know we're clear and ready to go, we'll continue along our meeting.
Through you, Madam Mayor, and we are live.
Thank you. And so be it resolved that council rise and report from closed meeting of municipal council at 8:10 p.m. and that council endorse all directions provided to staff. The closed meeting of municipal council held on February 8th, 2022. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Persuccini, Councillor Crothers, all those in favor? That's carried. Item G, there are no resolutions at this time. We have a confirming bylaw. Be it resolved that bylaw number 2022-011 being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the special meeting of municipal council held on February 8th, 2022 be taken and read and acted and signed by the mayor and municipal clerk. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Morton, Councillor Crone, all those in favor? And that's carried. And we have an adjournment at 8:11 p.m. moved by Councillor Crothers and Councillor Foster. All those in favor? And that's carried. Thank you. It's been quite a night.
Thank
It's a
you.
lot-
Have a good night, everyone.
A lot to think about.
Good night, folks. Have a good one.
Thank you to
Yes.
staff.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.